I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. The Nauvoo Expositor had been destroyed, and the city was in turmoil. Joseph Smith had intel from all over the state that various groups were forming mobs to descend upon the Mormon settlements. These mobs sought, peaceful resolution to the Mormon leadership's flagrant abuse of their own legal system, but, tensions were high, and any unexpected spark could set off this powder keg. Our timeline currently rests on the morning of June 18th, 1844. Joseph and Hiram would be dead in barely a week's time, but they were implementing every tool at their disposal to extricate themselves from their past transgressions. Joe had nearly declared martial law. He had credible threats that the printers of the Expositor were planning on destroying the Mormon press of the Nauvoo neighbor, and a night guard watch was set around the neighbor, and at the wharf where folks would disembark from the Mississippi where ferries were also tightly monitored by Joe's shadow force, the Danites. Joe also staked out a platoon of his personal bodyguards to watch over his home during the night. Mortal threats were a reality, and Joe was flexing his Nauvoo Legion muscles to exhibit for his enemies that he was well protected. On the morning of the 18th, Joe called on Major General Jonathan Dunham, a Danite, to gather the first cohort of the Legion in front of Joe's house that morning for a military parade. Parade here, that's probably too happy of a word for what actually happened. This was actually intimidation. If Joe could walk the streets of Nauvoo peacefully, surrounded by his legionnaires, it creates a sense of shock and awe for any of his enemies watching him so daringly walking around the city in broad daylight. Just like every good military leader, Jonathan Dunham gathered the first cohort in front of Joe's house at 9 a.m. Any of our military or our former military listeners, I got a question for you. Is that how military operations usually run? Everybody has a good meal of pork and beans and bread and milk and coffee, and then they go out and milk the family cow, then they feed the horses. Maybe they talk to their kids about schoolwork before mustering for military duty at 9 a.m. That's how it goes, right? So the Legion got together in front of Joe's house, and he had been up really late the previous night sending out orders and receiving and sending letters and intercepting letters meant for his enemies, and he got a late start in the morning. However, some good news awaited upon Joe's waking up. Quote, I was informed that there were several boxes of arms landed at the upper stone house, which were secured by the marshal. Soon after it was discovered that the arms, 40 stand, had been sent by Henry G. Sherwood, and the marshal bought them for the city. Now, what is a stand of arms? A stand is a complete set good enough for one soldier, which includes the rifle, the bayonet, the powder horn, the ball pouch, the leather carrying strap, and, a few other implements. So this shipment procured by Henry Sherwood was good enough to outfit 40 legionnaires with a weapon and all of the necessary equipment to use that weapon. We often overlook the logistics of running a militia in these days, but a militia without enough weapons isn't much of a militia. The equipment of the Nauvoo Legion was largely a patchwork of whatever each soldier could acquire for themselves, as the Legion itself simply didn't have many arms to issue. Guns were a precious commodity, and to have 40 of them show up in the morning when the city was very close to martial law, that was good news for the Prophet. There was a lot of growing pressure in the state of Illinois, though. Every letter that Joe received described dire straits and confusion from the Mormon settlements. Those who were threatened the most were the furthest disconnected from Nauvoo, particularly Uncle John Smith in Macedonia and Isaac Morley in Yelrum. Both of these cities were intersected by the anti-Mormon settlements of Carthage and Warsaw, cutting them off from the main contingent of the Nauvoo Legion in the city of Nauvoo. News of Joe's release from his sham municipal court hearing from the previous day was beginning to set ablaze the anti-Mormons. The anti-Mormons wanted justice, and the hearing that Joe had a week ago wasn't justice. This second hearing, which discharged the prisoners on riot, we discussed it last week, that would be sure to excite their vigilante proclivities even more. A man named Truman Gillett. Gillett? I'm not sure. It's not Gillette, like the shavers. It's Truman Gillett. We're going to go with Gillett. A man named Truman Gillett, and he's made a couple of appearances on the show before, but nothing really consequential. He just arrived this morning in Nauvoo from a Mississippi steamer. Along with dozens of others at this time, he made an affidavit of intel that he received while he was on the steamer headed to Nauvoo. He told his story to Wideout Willard Richards, acting as recorder for the city. Now, there's a lot to discuss, which we'll do after reading the affidavit, but by way of introduction, Truman Gillett apparently witnessed a conversation between two men on the steamer who were colluding with William Law to kidnap and kill Joseph Smith. The affidavit, quote, "While passing up the Ohio River on Steamboat, Massachusetts, deponent overheard two men, one a resident of Missouri and the other of Ohio, as reported, conversing together concerning incidents on the upper Mississippi, when one said to the other, 'If William Law could have succeeded in getting an introduction for us to Joe Smith, damn him, we would have gagged him and nabbed him, and damn him, all hell could not have rescued him from our hands.' The next morning, deponent got in conversation with the man before mentioned from Missouri, who stated that he had been on the upper Mississippi on business, that he stopped at Nauvoo on his way down with some 12 or 14 other men who laid a plan to kidnap Joe Smith, that some of the company queried about getting access to him, but one of them said he knew they could if he could find William Law. They called on William Law in the evening to get an introduction to their great prophet, and Law went with them to the gate where they were stopped by the police. And it was well for him that we did not succeed in getting an introduction to him." Deponent said, "Did William Law know your business?" And he said, "Yes." Deponent asked, "What have you against Joseph Smith? Did he ever injure you?" The man replied, "No, but he has others." "Did you ever see him?" "Yes, I was one who helped to run the Mormons from Missouri," and related many circumstances concerning the Missouri mob. Deponent said to the man he was acquainted with William Law, considered he was an honorable man, and was led to doubt his being engaged with him in a conspiracy against Joseph Smith. He replied, "God damn you, it is true whether you believe it or not," and repeatedly affirmed it. Deponent did not believe the statements of the man from Missouri as mentioned above until after hearing the recent developments before the city council. Signed, Truman Gillett, Jr. End quote. So who these men were that were colluding with William Law, we'll never know. When they planned to put their plan into effect, we'll never know. Whether the conversation with these two men was completely fabricated and we could slap the label of fake news on the whole affidavit, we'll never know. That's the primary trouble with all of the affidavits collected in Nauvoo during these middle 2 weeks of June 1844. It's affidavits like this, most likely spawning from mere rumors in the first place, which just heightened the excitement of the situation. While we can't determine how accurate the affidavit is with historical hindsight, what we do know is that the decisions made following these affidavits were heavily influenced by said affidavits. Reacting to the intel that he had received the previous evening and all of these affidavits, and probably wanting to flex a little bit more, Joseph Smith made a crucial mistake around noon on this day of June 18th, 1844. Here it is, quote, "To the marshal or the city of Nauvoo. From the newspapers around us and the current reports as brought in from the surrounding country, I have good reason to fear that a mob is organizing to come upon this city and plunder and destroy said city, as well as murder the citizens. And by virtue of the authority vested in me as mayor and to preserve the city and lives of the citizens, I do hereby declare the said city under martial law. The officers, therefore, of the Nauvoo Legion, the police, as well as all others, will strictly see that no persons or property pass in or out of the city without due orders. Signed, Joseph Smith, Mayor." End quote. Now, Nauvoo was officially under a declaration of martial law by the highest-ranking commanding officer of the Legion, who also happened to be the mayor of the city and the sole authority religious leader of the near total majority Mormon city. And here represents the greatest underlying issue that people had with Joseph Smith and his religious movement. He was in total control of all three pillars of societal organizations: military, government, and religion. He was the top of these three pillars. And the fourth pillar of societal organizations, the press, had just been forcefully subjugated to his power with the destruction of the Expositor printing press. Beyond that, when a military leader declares martial law, it opens up a wide range of powers not otherwise enjoyed by the government. It allows the military to infringe on constitutional rights by quartering soldiers, imprisoning people, limiting movement, instating curfews, directing factories for wartime production, and drafting soldiers from citizens, among other things. It also opens up emergency funding. But because martial law is such a broad power, it's very, very rarely used because non-combatants, just regular citizens, lose their minds under martial law. Rights aren't rights if the government can take them away at a moment's notice. They're temporary privileges, and Joe took those privileges away in response to his own act of fascism and the ensuing chaos. This would prove to be a massive mistake, as the people, Mormon and non-Mormon alike, groaned under the increased powers granted by this declaration of martial law in the city. And in accordance with this new declaration, Joe held his parade in full battle regalia the same afternoon. The number of legionnaires who filled the streets for this parade is unknown. And once again, the word parade really isn't an apt word because it's a flex, right? The number of people involved, the number of legionnaires in this parade, it's unknown, but it's suspected to be anything from a few hundred, with the first cohort under the command of acting Brigadier General Piggy Bank Stephen Markham, and the second cohort under Colonel Hosea Stout, acting under the direction of Major General Jonathan Dunham. Maybe hundreds, maybe thousands, we don't really know. They mustered their powder and ball in full uniform and gathered on the streets in front of the Nauvoo mansion, where Joseph Smith, quote, stood in full uniform on the top of the frame of a building, end quote. And here, Joseph Smith made his final public speech as the first prophet of the Mormons. Yes, I mean it, his final public speech. And there's so much to tease out of this speech. And we've discussed so many of Joe's speeches on the show, and this is the last one. And it lasted about an hour and a half, and the synopsis was recorded by a guy named Joseph G. Hovey, another person named William G. Sterrett, Robert Campbell, and George A. Smith, and a few others who remembered what was said after the event. Now, we have to take what's recorded with a grain of salt because it was recorded initially by Robert Campbell and was supplemented at a later time by statements from these other men. Regardless of the source for it, the speech does a fantastic review of everything that's happened the last few weeks on the podcast. So let's dig in to Joe's final public speech as the Prophet of Mormonism. Quote, I'm going to give a little commentary as we go. It is thought by some that our enemies would be satisfied with my destruction, but I tell you that as soon as they have shed my blood, they will thirst for the blood of every man in whose heart dwells a single spark of the spirit of the fullness of the gospel. The opposition of these men is moved by the spirit of the adversary of all righteousness. It is not only to destroy me, but every man and woman who dares believe the doctrines that God hath inspired me to teach to this generation. He is leaning really hard into the persecution complex here, in the persecution narrative that he had been crafting for over a decade by this point, and now he's reaping the benefits of it, right? He's going to continue to lean further into that as we get further into the talk here. But it's also notable that he is looping every single one of the Mormons in together with him. If he goes down, you all go down with him. That's a powerful mind control mechanism, especially as this man is in full battle regalia, standing in front of a parade of hundreds or maybe as much as over 1,000 of his soldiers with arms ready to take the fight to whoever is going to hurt their prophet, priest, and king. We have never violated the laws of our country. We have every right to live under their protection and are entitled to all the privileges guaranteed by our state and national constitutions. That's just a lie. We have turned the barren, bleak prairies and swamps of this state into beautiful towns, farms, and cities by our industry, and the men who seek our destruction and cry thief, treason, riot, etc., are those who themselves violate the laws, steal and plunder from their neighbors, and seek to destroy the innocent, heralding forth lies to screen themselves from the just punishment of their crimes by bringing destruction upon this innocent people. That's the old know you defense, right? We're not guilty of theft, of treason, of riot, etc. They are the ones who are guilty of it, and they're just projecting those crimes onto us. We're the victims in all of this, right? It's capturing this victimized mentality. He continues, I call God, angels, and all men to witness that we are innocent of the charges which are heralded forth through the public prince against us by our enemies. And while they assemble together in unlawful mobs to take away our rights and destroy our lives, they think to shield themselves under the refuge of lies which they have thus wickedly fabricated. That's a fascinating point, isn't it? The people who are supposedly persecuting Joseph Smith and trying to get him to, be held accountable to the system of laws that everybody else is accountable to. They are the ones who have fabricated all of the charges. They are the ones who've done the fake news that are trying to kill each and every one of us. It really is remarkable how much he's leaning into this mentality. Many people may disagree about whether or not he truly believed what he was saying, or these statements are all deliberately contrived for the powers that they granted him when he would say these things. And I think reasonable people can disagree about his genuineness in all of these statements. We have forwarded a particular account of all of our doings to the governor. We are ready to obey his commands, and we expect that protection at his hands, which we know to be our just die. We have taken the counsel of Judge Thomas and have been tried before a civil magistrate on the charge of riot, not that the law required it, but because the judge advised it as a precautionary measure to allay all possible pretext for excitement. We were legally acquitted by Esquire Wells, who is a good judge of law. Had we been before the circuit, the Supreme, or any other court of law in the state or nation, we should have been acquitted, for we have broken no law. Once again, this idea that Joseph Smith was able to handle any legal problems within his own municipal court underpins a lot of the problems that the anti-Mormons had with the Mormon settlement in Nauvoo. Because he wasn't accountable. If he had gone to the circuit court, well, granted, the circuit court was in Carthage. That is one of the two hotbed cities of anti-Mormonism. He couldn't have gotten a fair trial there. But to claim that his trials were fair in Nauvoo is equally fallacious. It's all very problematic. And them holding the hearing was, yes, under the recommendation of Judge Thomas, who met with Joseph Smith after he had his first trial and was discharged. And Judge Thomas told him, you got to do better. You got to have a better hearing. And they had that better hearing, and that's what we discussed last week. But even that wasn't good enough. And the fact that Joseph Smith is leaning into this leads me to believe that he also knew that that wasn't good enough. However, because he is just stating this propaganda from the pulpit, the proverbial pulpit, right? He's standing on top of a construction lattice of the Nauvoo house, right? He's doing so in full battle regalia, holding his sword up to the sky with 1,000 of his legionnaires below him and citizens of the city of Nauvoo surrounding and hearing this prophet's speech. He says the propaganda, that makes it true, right? In the minds of all of the people who were there, who he had conditioned for years to believe anything that he said to be true. He continues. Constable Bettesworth was the first arresting officer who approached Joseph Smith with the arrest warrant by Judge Morrison from Carthage, the circuit court in Carthage. Constable Bettesworth was the first person who arrested Joseph Smith before his first trial, which caused him to have the second trial that we discussed last week. Constable Bettesworth comes here with a writ requiring us to go before Mr. Morrison, quote, or some other justice of the peace of the county, end quote, to answer to the charge of riot. We acknowledged ourselves his prisoners and were ready to go before any magistrate in any precinct in this part of the county or anywhere else where our lives could be protected from the mob who have published the resolutions for our extermination, which you have just heard read. Now, that's an interesting point, right? Because Joseph Smith could not get a fair trial at Carthage, but Constable Bettesworth's arrest warrant from Mr. Morrison said to bring him to the circuit court or some other justice of the peace of the county. Therefore, Joseph Smith interpreted that as we can have our hearing in Nauvoo, and that's good enough. But Constable Bettesworth said, no, this was sworn out by Mr. Morrison from the circuit court in Carthage. I'm taking you back there. And Joseph Smith argued with Bettesworth and then put Bettesworth under the arrest of John P. Green, the city marshal of Nauvoo, right? So that is an interesting point. And, well, there's not much to say beyond the fact that Joseph Smith could not have a fair trial in Carthage, but any trial that he had in Nauvoo also wasn't fair. He continues. He breaks the law, Constable Bettesworth, and refuses us this privilege, declaring that we shall go before Morrison in Carthage and no one else, when he knew that a numerous mob was collecting there who are publicly pledged to destroy our lives. Yeah, not only could Joseph Smith not get a fair trial in Carthage, but the number of anti-Mormons there basically ensured that if Joseph Smith set foot in the city of Carthage, he was gonna die. Vigilante justice would be served because justice couldn't be served in any other way. Joseph Smith had proved himself immune so many times. It was under these circumstances that we availed ourselves of the legal right of the ancient, high, and constitutional privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, and were brought before the municipal court of this city and discharged from the illegal detention under which we were held by Constable Bettesworth. All mob men, priests, thieves, and bogus makers, apostates and adulterers who combined to destroy this people now raise the hue and cry throughout the state that we resist the law, in order to raise a pretext for calling together thousands more of infuriated mob men to murder, destroy, plunder, and ravish the innocent. Tapping into the Missouri-Mormon War persecution narrative that had been contrived over a decade ago, and saying that the people crying foul that Joseph Smith didn't stand a fair trial, they are doing it just for the effect of being able to kill Joseph Smith and then kill each and every one of you. It's powerful mind control. We are American citizens. We live upon a soil for the liberties of which our fathers periled their lives and spilt their blood upon the battlefield. Those rights so dearly purchased shall not be disgracefully trodden underfoot by lawless marauders without at least a noble effort on our part to sustain our liberties. Will you all, and now this is really quite masterful, how he taps into the groupthink mentality here. Will you all stand by me to the death and sustain at the peril of your lives the laws of our country and the liberty and privileges which our fathers have transmitted unto us, sealed with their sacred blood? And here in parentheses, the history of the church says, "Ay!" shouted thousands. He then said, "It is well. If you had not done it, I would have gone out there," pointing to the west, "and would have raised up a mightier people." End quote. The coercion and the mind control in that statement is truly powerful. Will you stand by me to the death, to the peril of your own lives, for the liberties and privileges of the forefathers that our forefathers fought for and that we enjoy as American citizens? And everybody shouts, "Aye." And then he said, "Well, that's good because you need me. I don't need you. If you said no, I would have gone to the west and raised up a mightier people than you. I am the one who is dealing with you. You are all blessed to be part of my flock." It's really, really powerful. But these are skills that Joseph Smith had been honing for, 2 decades of his life, right? I mean, he's almost 40 years old. He's been in the business of being a preacher and being a religious leader for almost a decade and a half at this point. These are skills that he had tapped into and had cultivated and had honed for so many years. And this truly is quite a show of force of his own mental powers. I call upon all men, from Maine to the Rocky Mountains and from Mexico to British America, whose hearts thrill with horror to behold the rights of freemen trampled underfoot, to come to the deliverance of this people from the cruel hand of oppression, cruelty, anarchy, and misrule to which they have been long made subject. Come, all ye lovers of liberty, break the oppressor's rod, loose the iron grasp of mobocracy, and bring to condign punishment all those who trample underfoot the principles of our glorious Constitution and the people's rights. And here it says, in the history of the church, drawing his sword and presenting it to heaven, he said, I call God and angels to witness that I have unsheathed my sword with a firm and unalterable determination that this people shall have their legal rights and be protected from mob violence, or my blood shall be spilt upon the ground like water, and my body consigned to the silent tomb. While I live, I will never tamely submit to the dominion of cursed mobocracy. I would welcome death rather than submit to this oppression. And it would be sweet, oh so sweet, to rest in the grave rather than submit to this oppression, agitation, annoyance, confusion, and alarm upon alarm any longer. I call upon all my friends of truth and liberty to come to our assistance, and may the thunders of the Almighty and the forked lightnings of heaven and pestilence and war and bloodshed come down on those ungodly men who seek to destroy my life and the lives of this innocent people. His charisma is bleeding through the record. It is crying from the ground 180 years in the future. This truly is an amazing window into the mind and practices of Joseph Smith. I do not regard my own life. I am ready to be offered as a sacrifice for this people. For what can our enemies do? Only kill the body, and their power is then at an end. Stand firm, my friends. Never flinch. Do not seek to save your lives, for he that is afraid to die for truth will lose eternal life. Hold out to the end, and we shall be resurrected and become like gods, and reign in celestial kingdoms, principalities, and eternal dominions, while this cursed mob will sink to hell, the portion of all those who shed innocent blood. God has tried you. You are a good people. Therefore I love you with all my heart. Greater love hath no man than that he should lay down his life for his friends. You've stood by me in the hour of trouble, and I am willing to sacrifice my life for your preservation. May the Lord God of Israel bless you forever and ever. I say it in the name of Jesus of Nazareth, and in the authority of the holy priesthood, which he hath conferred upon me. End quote. That was Joe's final public sermon before his death. He gave it to a crowd of hundreds or thousands in full battle regalia, standing atop a building under construction to carry his voice even further, given to the first 2 cohorts of the Nauvoo Legion. Now, there's a very famous portrait of Joseph Smith standing on scaffolding with the Nauvoo Mansion and the Nauvoo Temple in the background, with crowds of people listening to him while his sword is raised to the sky, and Hiram and presumably a redcoat William Clayton are standing behind Joseph Smith. And some of you have probably seen this portrait. That portrait depicts Joe's last public speech that we just read, and it was painted in 1888 by a guy named John Hafen. This is one of those few times where we can actually visualize history, and I encourage you to do so by clicking the link to see the painting in the show notes of this week's episode. After this grand speech, Joe took his militia and, quote, with my staff rode in front of the legion, marched up Main Street, and returned to our former parade ground, end quote. This was no benign military parade. This was a show of force. This was done to effectively intimidate any enemies of the prophet as he rode around the city surrounded by hundreds or possibly even 1,000 or two of his uniformed soldiers who were all willing to give their life in exchange for the prophet's safety. But to consider the broader context of what he had done in his court system, the past week, all the letters that he sent, all the threats that he had received, in some ways, an enemy watching this parade, they must have felt defeated. Look, we know what happens in a week in 1844, but nobody watching this parade knew what was going to happen. If a person is just sitting back and considering the tactics of the Mormon versus the anti-Mormon battlefield that lays before us, this parade looked like Joe had won. He got his court to throw out the charges against him. He defied arrest warrants with impunity. Even if the state militia invaded Nauvoo, he was surrounded by thousands of men who owed fealty to only him, not to their family or country, but to their cult leader. He must have seemed untouchable at this moment. But that was merely the outward appearance that he put on as this show of force. What was really going through his mind was a complex game of defensive plays to keep him, his family, and his legacy secure. Upon the dismissal of the Legion from this quote-unquote parade, as he called it, Joe retired to his home to exchange more letters and to review affidavits that were being collected about the movements of the anti-Mormons surrounding Nauvoo. An ever-present question remained in Joe's mind. How quickly could Talos be mobilized? And Talos is our metaphorical war machine being constructed in sheds and dark alleys of the city of Nauvoo. The leadership spent the last 5 years collecting armor, machinery, weapons, and the energy source for this war machine. Each Mormon convert thickened the armor. Each new factory equipped Talos with stronger machinery. Each new conscript to the Nauvoo Legion added killing power to Talos' weapon systems. Each proclamation of persecution from the stand fueled Talos with a deeper energy source. Years of construction and preparation have been devoted to this Mormon revolutionary war machine, set to blaze a path into the great unknown West, where it could become stronger and better equipped for a complete and total war path straight to Washington. For Joseph Smith, he was so heavily considering dragging this Talos prototype out of Nauvoo and take it west before it was ready, and it seemed like an only option. The Rocky Mountains would provide enough cover for Talos to gather strength, and the Great Basin was clearly on Joe's mind. His vehicle of choice was this Mormon war machine, but was it ready? The contents of his letters reveal to me that he thought that it wasn't yet time, but that the time to mobilize his forces was nearing. Quote, "To H.T. Huggins, Esquire, Sir, I feel grateful for your favors. The enemy, or mob, is prowling in the southern and eastern part of the county and threatening us with extermination, and we ask the friends of peace and good government everywhere to use their influence in suppressing the spirit of mobocracy and sustain us in our righteous course. So far as you can conscientiously speak in our behalf and lend your influence in our favor for the public good, your favors will be highly appreciated. Please show this letter to Dr. Hickok and such confidential friends as you think proper. The bearer, Dr. Wakefield, will give you all particulars. In haste, I remain your friend, respectfully, signed Joseph Smith." End quote. When Joe finished writing this letter on June 18th, quote, "Messengers arrived from Carthage and report that the mob had received intelligence from the governor," end quote. This was big news. The governor actually chiming in. This was huge. Both the Mormons and the anti-Mormons were awaiting communication from Governor Thomas Ford to determine how to act and whose side he was going to take. Governor Ford was a smart guy, and we're going to see his intellect play further into the coming week of Nauvoo history. But both sides wanted his blessing to do whatever they needed to the other side. Joe wanted Governor Ford to recognize what was happening as religious persecution and baseless accusations. The anti-Mormons wanted Governor Ford to recognize the outrages committed by the Mormons and that burning the Expositor printing press was the final straw. Whoever Governor Ford sided with would win the day, and everybody's decisions hinged on communication from Governor Ford. Also worth pointing out, both sides were asking Governor Ford to attend to the matters personally instead of sending representatives. Now, if we remember back to the Missouri-Mormon War of 1838, that's episodes like 38 through 52 or so, this was the primary complaint with the Mormons and the anti-Mormons in Missouri that they had with Governor Lilburn Boggs. The dude never left his office, and he just took meetings and he wrote letters and then he sent representatives. His personal presence would have given the weight of the government to whichever side he chose, but Boggs's refusal to appear in person exacerbated the problems, and Joe was determined to not make that same mistake again. I would assume that Governor Ford also learned from Governor Boggs's mistakes, and this issue of the brewing Illinois-Mormon War instead of Missouri-Mormon War took precedence over everything else going on in his life at the time. There was a problem, though. Information traveled at the speed of a horse. Governor Ford was only receiving the first letters and meetings with folks from Nauvoo and Carthage about the situation, and he wasn't up to speed on what was going on in the cities at the time. Everything was on a multiple days lag. He hadn't yet received Joe's letters about the Nauvoo municipal hearings, which discharged Joe on charges of riot. He'd yet to receive the latest resolution passed by the anti-Mormons in Carthage for their meeting on the 14th of June, which called for a war of extermination against the Mormons. All he knew by the 18th was that the Mormons had burned down a printing press. However, upon receiving all of these meetings and letters, Governor Ford resolved to immediately travel to the area himself, and he likely began his roughly 3 to 5 day journey sometime on the 16th or 17th of June. But because Governor Ford wasn't yet there, rumors circulated about who he would side with upon his arrival. Accordingly, quote, "The mob damned the governor as being as bad as Joe Smith. The anti-Mormons did not care for him, and they were just as willing he would not help them as if he would," end quote. Also, two guys named Cyrus Canfield and Gilbert Belknap made an affidavit about what they had witnessed the prior day in Carthage. Quote, "Affiants say that on yesterday, June 17th, 1844 at Carthage, certain persons, to wit, Dr. and it's blank, unfortunately, Dr. blank Barnes and Joseph H. Jackson," that's a fun name to see in here, "Joseph H. Jackson, having entered into conversation with your deponents, among other things declared that the governor of Illinois was as big a scoundrel as Joseph Smith, and that he is the damnedest scoundrel that was ever suffered to live, that they did not care for the governor, and had rather that the governor would side with Smith, that they, the mob, were coming to Nauvoo with a sufficient force to take Smith, and if the people endeavored to prevent them, they should kill the people, and that if Smith had left Nauvoo, they had determined to destroy the mansion and other buildings," end quote. Affidavits like this fill the pages of the history of the church. Did this actually happen? Did these men actually witness this Dr. Blank Barnes and Joseph Jackson talking about killing all the Mormons, burning down the city and burning down the Nauvoo mansion and other buildings, and not caring about the governor and hoping that the governor would side with Joseph Smith so that they could go in with force and attack the city? You see, what they claim in the affidavit, after what I just read, is even more speculative and more fascinating to me, and even harder to prove. Quote, "Your deponents further say that one John Eller declared that he had lived in Missouri and was at the massacre of the Mormons at Haun's Mill, that he had killed one Mormon, and that he had left Missouri on purpose to fight the Mormons, and would hunt a Mormon as he would a deer," end quote. Did these men who were making the affidavit actually witness a person boasting about killing a Mormon at Haun's Mill? Was he actually a Missourian who fought in the Missouri-Mormon War, or was he just the town drunkard talking a big game like usual? But the affidavit didn't stop there. Quote, "Your deponents further say that they heard that about 100 persons had already arrived from Missouri and were expecting a many more from that state. And your deponents further say that they heard in Carthage that they had already received a number of guns and ammunition and provisions from St. Louis in order to prosecute their attack upon Nauvoo," end quote. So not only was this guy talking about killing a Mormon during the Huntsville massacre, and he left Missouri to come to Illinois just for the purposes of hunting Mormons, but there were as many as 100 other men who had arrived in Carthage from Missouri with provisions for war against the Mormons in Nauvoo. True or not, this affidavit had weight, and many other affidavits like this fill page after page after page of the history of the church. Another affidavit by Carlos W. Lyon claimed, quote, while at St. Louis, Missouri, it was a common topic that they were furnishing arms and ammunition to be sent by steamboat to Warsaw, Illinois, and said if the people of Warsaw need 500 men to give notice, and also saw a cannon landed from the steamer Mermaid at Warsaw, end quote. Multiple affidavits from Alan T. Waite, Solomon Hancock, William Garner, John G. Lofton, Isaac Morley, Gardner Snow, Edmund Durfee, all of them claim that the vicious anti-Mormon Levi Williams was running around with a posse and seizing arms from the Mormons, forcing them to either fight with him and help him take Joseph Smith as prisoner or fight against him alongside their prophet. Now, they claim that this evil Levi Williams said, quote, he would take Smith by law if they could, or if the governor would not grant a writ to take him, they would take him anyhow. Levi Williams also said that if the people would not give Smith up, they would lay the whole city of Nauvoo in ashes, end quote. This affidavit further claimed that Levi Williams had absolutely no regard for the law and that, quote, they intended to proceed against the Mormons, whether they got any authority from the governor or not, end quote. Another affidavit about Colonel Levi Williams. Levi Williams, we'll talk about him a bit more going through this episode and in coming episodes. He's the token anti-Mormon, right? Like, we can see this in many ways as like Joseph Smith versus Colonel Levi Williams. Colonel Levi Williams was a member of the state Illinois militia. He's definitely not a member of the Nauvoo Legion militia. Levi Williams was one of the 5 people who was put on trial for murdering Joseph and Hiram Smith. He was not a friend of the Mormons. He was the ultimate anti-Mormon in this conflict. But another affidavit detailed exactly what Levi Williams would do to ensure compliance with his evil anti-Mormon campaign to kill the prophet. And according to this affidavit, this is given by Anson Call, David Evans, and William E. Horner, Colonel Levi Williams wanted to tar and feather the circuit judge for not issuing a new arrest warrant for Joe after the first one had failed to bring him to Carthage. Further, Joe received intel from somebody about a troubling development incited by the enemy, Colonel Levi Williams, who was displeased that a Captain Loveland of the Illinois State Militia wouldn't participate in the Mormon arresting posse. And this is a fascinating story, and one of those stories that you're like, that just seems crazy to me. But it's one of the stories in the history of the church based on affidavits, and it's really hard to tell if it's true or not. So Captain Loveland didn't want to help Levi Williams arrest Joseph Smith, and this is what happened, apparently. Quote, on Sunday, the 16th, a committee of the mob went to the house of Captain Chester Loveland, who lives 4 miles southeast of Warsaw, and required him to call out his militia company to join the posse of David Bettesworth. David Bettesworth was the first constable who arrested Joseph Smith just like a week ago, right before his first trial in Nauvoo. To go to Nauvoo and arrest me in the city council, me being Joseph. He peremptorily refused to comply with their request. The same posse returned on the 17th with an order, as I stated, from the governor, which Loveland believed to be a forgery, and therefore still refused to go on any terms. The posse then reported his refusal to Colonel Levi Williams, who appointed a committee of 12 to lynch, tar and feather Captain Loveland on the 18th, which committee went that evening and arrived about midnight. So the committee wanted to get Captain Chester Loveland to call out his militia, and he said, no, I'm not going to do that. Then they returned with an order from the governor, and he said, no, I think that's a forgery. And then they went and told this guy, Colonel Levi Williams, this ultimate anti-Mormon, and Levi Williams sent a committee of 12 guys to lynch Captain Loveland and tar and feather him. It continues. Loveland, who had been informed of Williams's order, prepared himself for defense and kept watch. As soon as they came and he saw their number and that they were provided with tar bucket, bag of feathers, and a bundle of withes, in addition to their firearms, he blew out his light and placed himself in a suitable position to defend the door which he had fastened and the window. They went round his house several times, tried the door, rapped, called him by name, and consulted together. Some were for breaking the door, others thought it too dangerous. They knew he must be in there, for they were near his door when the light was blown out. Finally, their courage failed, and notifying him to leave the country immediately, they took their departure. During this trying time, Loveland did not speak." End quote. So basically, Loveland refused to join Colonel Levi Williams in arresting the prophet, and the posse returned with that order from Ford telling Loveland to comply, and he presumed it was a forgery, and he still refused, and they nearly lynched him, tarred and feathered him, and dragged him out of his house and beat the living hell out of him for just not calling out his platoon and joining the arresting posse in their invasion of Nauvoo to arrest Joseph Smith. It's just so crazy, and there's so many moving parts to consider in all of this. And understandably, Colonel Levi Williams hated Joseph Smith, and he wanted the prophet to answer for his crimes. But would he go to the lengths of threatening a fellow member of the Illinois militia with death for not helping him? I mean, it seems to strain credulity, but that's the theme throughout many of these affidavits. Can we trust any of them? Can we believe the contents of any of these affidavits to be true? Well, if we turn over to the Warsaw Signal, printed by one of the founding fathers of the anti-Mormon political movement, Thomas Coke Sharp, we can see substantiation for some of the claims made in these affidavits. Notably, one of the resolutions of one of their many anti-Mormon meetings stated, quote, "The citizens of this county are ordered to assemble at their various places of rendezvous on Wednesday next by the officer from whom Smith was rescued," that's Colonel Levi Williams, that's him, "and there to receive general orders to cooperate as a posse to aid in arresting Smith," end quote. In addition to this order to comply with Colonel Levi Williams, Thomas Sharp also added to the same edition of the Warsaw Signal this fascinating detail, which complicated matters, but also adds weight to the affidavits made in Nauvoo stating the anti-Mormons were being supported by the Missourians. Quote, "Citizens of the adjoining state," that's Missouri, "territory and counties who feel interested in bringing to justice the most depraved wretch on earth will observe that they can join our standard and act with the posse comitatus without violating the law. We are all prepared in this county to do our duty. If the governor orders out the militia, there will be no difficulty. If not, we are determined to try the posse comitatus, being assured that the citizens of surrounding counties and of Missouri and Iowa will join us. As soon as the day for a general cooperation is set, we will notify by a handbill all the citizens of the adjacent country," end quote. So the anti-Mormons in Carthage and Warsaw were calling on the oldest enemies of the Mormons, the Missourians, for support, and that amped up the excitement even more. And in that same edition of the Warsaw Signal, it also reported details of the support that the anti-Mormons were receiving. Under the article titled, "The Preparation." The preparation. This is accelerating the events towards a precipice, isn't it? Quote, "The preparation. Our town in the last weeks has been in a constant state of excitement. Business has been almost entirely suspended." Maybe some of us can empathize with that. It's in May of 2020. "Business has been almost entirely suspended, and every able-bodied man is under arms and almost constantly in drill. On Monday last, about 150 men mustered in this place under the command of General Knox. The attention paid by every man and the anxiety manifested to acquire knowledge of military movements is a full guarantee for the good conduct of our men in the coming emergency." In Carthage and Green Plains, the citizens are all in arms, and as far as we can hear, throughout the country, every man is ready for the conflict. We have assurances that our neighbors in Missouri and Iowa will aid us. In Clark County, Missouri, we understand that many are holding themselves in readiness to march as soon as wanted. From Rushville, Missouri, we have just learned by express that 300 men have enlisted for the struggle. McDonough County, Illinois, is all alive and ready for the word of command. From Keosauqua, Iowa, we have just received intelligence by a resident of that place that the citizens are in arms in our behalf and only wait our call. From Keokuk and the river towns, we learn that all are arming. General Stapp of this brigade is requested to call out the militia and hold himself in readiness. Captain Grover last week obtained from Quincy 59 muskets. Men and arms are promised from St. Louis, and everything betokens prosperity to our enterprise. D.W. Matthews, who was sent last Saturday to St. Louis, has just returned by the Die Vernon, that's a steamer. He has succeeded in procuring cannon and has brought up a good supply of ammunition. Mr. Simpson and Mr. Thompson have just arrived from their trip to Missouri and report all is right and ready. To our friends at a distance, we say, come. We are too weak in this county without aid to effect our object. Come. You will be doing your God and your country service in aiding us to rid earth of a most heaven-daring wretch. End quote. The fact of the matter is, this was a chaotic time in Nauvoo and Illinois at large. Rumors were spread, and rumors became affidavits, and affidavits could be given by anybody claiming anything, and those affidavits carried weight. How did they carry weight? Well, permit me to read a very brief letter that Joe drafted on June 20th with the power of all of these affidavits behind it. Quote, to President John Tyler, Sir, I have just enclosed to the governor of the state of Illinois copies of the enclosed affidavits and Nauvoo Neighbor Extra. I'm sorry to say that the state of Missouri, not contented with robbing, driving, and murdering many of the Latter-day Saints, are now joining the mob of this state for the purpose of the utter extermination of the Mormons, as they have resolved. And now, sir, as President of the United States, will you render that protection which the Constitution guarantees in case of insurrection and rebellion and save the innocent and oppressed from such horrid persecution? With great respect, I have the honor to be your most obedient servant. Signed, Joseph Smith, Mayor. End quote. Yeah, Joseph Smith wrote to the President of the United States asking for protection against this new wave of what he called persecution. Also, a brief side note, Joseph Smith, dude, you're addressing the President of the United States and you called yourselves Mormons? Come on, man. Couldn't you, see the future and know that in 2020 that was a victory for Satan? Anyway, my point remains, whether or not the contents of the affidavits were true, they carried weight and found their way not only to Governor Thomas Ford, but to President John Tyler as well. Of course, the president never replied to this letter because by the time he received the letter, the problem was kind of solved. But still, these affidavits were believed to be true, even if the person giving the affidavit fabricated it. It should also be noted that the Mormon affidavits wasn't the only misinformation making its way to Governor Thomas Ford, and he reports information coming to him during his trip from Springfield to Carthage to handle this situation in person as, quote, of the most fearful character. It's a pretty long reading here, but it's just so good from Thomas Ford. Quote, this is the history of Illinois. Beginning on page 330. You'll find a link to it in the show notes. A system of excitement and agitation was artfully planned and executed with tact. It consisted in spreading reports and rumors of the most fearful character as examples. On the morning before my arrival at Carthage, I was awakened at an early hour by the frightful report which was asserted with confidence and apparent consternation that the Mormons had already commenced the work of burning, destruction, and murder. and that every man capable of bearing arms was instantly wanted at Carthage for the protection of the country. We lost no time in starting, but when we arrived at Carthage, we could hear no more concerning this story. Again, during the few days that the militia were encamped at Carthage, frequent applications were made to me to send a force here and a force there and a force all about the country to prevent murders, robberies, and larcenies, which, it was said, were threatened by the Mormons. No such forces were sent, nor were any such offenses committed at the time, except the stealing of some provisions, and there was never the least proof that it was done by a Mormon. Again, on my late visit to Hancock County, I was informed by some of their violent enemies that the larcenies of the Mormons had become unusually numerous and insufferable. They indeed admitted that but little had been done in this way in their immediate vicinity, but they insisted that 16 horses had been stolen by the Mormons in one night near Lima in the county of Adams. At the close of the expedition, I called at this same town of Lima, and upon inquiry was told that no horses had been stolen in that neighborhood, but that 16 horses had been stolen in one night in Hancock County. This last informant, being told of the Hancock story, again changed the venue to another distant settlement on the edge of Adams County. End quote. Governor Ford simply couldn't trust a single thing that he heard from anybody. It was a complex situation with lots of moving parts, and all this complication was exacerbated by the constant flow of misinformation and rumors becoming facts. You see, Thomas Ford was a good guy. He knew the history of the Mormons in Missouri, and while he couldn't come out openly and say it, he knew that if he bungled this up the way that Lilburn Boggs did, he might get a visit from Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell too. So he was extra cautious in this circumstance. Now, Ford wasn't influenced as much as the citizens of Hancock County because he wasn't a citizen there himself, right? That put Governor Ford in the tough position of not truly empathizing with either side, but still having the force and power of the state law, the state government behind anything he did while he was trying to see clearly from his 30,000-foot view of the circumstances. Ford was also smart enough to see people's personal motivations in blowing up this latest controversy during an election year. Quote, "It is indeed unfortunate for the Mormons' peace that they did not divide in elections according to their individual preferences or political principles like other people. This one principle and practice of theirs," he's referring to voting in a block, "arrayed against them in deadly hostility all aspirants for office who were not sure of their support, all who had been unsuccessful in elections, and all who were too proud to court the Mormon influence with all their friends and connections. These also were the active men in blowing up the fury of the people in hopes that a popular movement might be set on foot, which would result in the expulsion or extermination of the Mormon voters. For this purpose, public meetings had been called, inflammatory speeches had been made, exaggerated reports had been extensively circulated, committees had been appointed who rode night and day to spread the reports and solicit the aid of neighboring counties. And at a public meeting at Warsaw, resolutions were passed to expel or exterminate the Mormon population. This was not, however, a movement which was unanimously concurred in. The county contained a goodly number of inhabitants in favor of peace, or who at least desired to be neutral in such a contest. These people were stigmatized by the name of Jack Mormons, and there were not a few of the more furious exciters of the people, looking at you, Colonel Levi Williams, who openly expressed their intention to involve those people in the common expulsion or extermination." End quote. So not only was everything the Mormons did the next outrage du jour for the people to get excited about, but failing politicians who were too proud to curry the Mormon vote used the outrage as an opportunity to step up and exhibit leadership and make themselves look better in the eyes of the public. I'm looking at you, Colonel Levi Williams. Anybody who opposed violent extermination of the Mormons were considered Mormon sympathizer, the Jack Mormons of the day, and they were threatened with the same extermination that the Mormons would suffer. And as Governor Ford points out, this was the result of the Mormons voting as a block instead of for their own preferences, because if they voted individually, then people like Colonel Levi Williams and other politicians trying to make a name for themselves wouldn't use the Mormons as a wedge issue. And there are simply so many angles by which to consider this conflict and so many factors which played into all of it. Thomas Coke Sharp at the Warsaw Signal, he bears a fair amount of the blame for fanning these flames, because in addition to daily extras that the Signal printed, the issue which contained the resolution to exterminate the Mormons also reprinted witness statements from the Missouri-Mormon War Court of Inquiry. And in that court of inquiry, Dr. Samson Avard, a Mormon Danite turned enemy, testified about the existence of the Danites and the movements of the Mormon extra-military shadow force. The Warsaw Signal reprinting his testimony there? That was just to add fuel to the fire. However, Samson Avard never would have testified about the Danites if Joe and Hinchpin Rigdon hadn't created the Danites in the first place amidst a war against the state of Missouri, and then the Danites would never have been used as ammunition against the Mormons during this next impending war that we're seeing come into sharper focus every episode. However, because the Missouri-Mormon War had happened and the Danites were a real thing, the fury which fueled the anti-Mormons in Illinois had deep roots in Missouri from a decade before. There's just so much to consider here, and Governor Ford knew that as well. As soon as Governor Ford arrived in Carthage to figure out just what the hell was going on, he sent a letter to Joseph Smith, quote, "To the Honorable, the Mayor, and Common Council of the City of Nauvoo. Gentlemen," you can tell he's so done with this already, just by the tone of his voice. "Gentlemen, having heard of the excitement in this part of the country, and judging that my presence here might be necessary to preserve the peace and enforce the laws, I arrived at this place this morning. Both before and since my arrival, complaints of a grave character have been made to me of certain proceedings of your honorable body. As chief magistrate, it is my duty to see that impartial justice shall be done, uninfluenced either by the excitement here or in your city. I think before any decisive measure shall be adopted, that I ought to hear the allegations and defenses of all parties. By adopting this course, I have some hope that the evils of war may be averted, and at any rate, I will be enabled by it to understand the true merits of the present difficulties and shape my course with reference to law and justice. For these reasons, I have requested that you will send out to me at this place, in Carthage, one or more well-informed and discreet persons who will be capable of laying before me your version of the matter and of receiving from me such explanations and resolutions as may be determined on. Colonel Elam S. Freeman will present you this note in the character of a herald from the governor. You will respect his character as such and permit him to pass and repass free from molestation. Your messengers are assured of protection in person and property and will be returned to you in safety. I am, gentlemen, with high consideration, most respectfully, your obedient servant. Signed, Thomas Ford, Governor and Commander-in-Chief. I love he used the full title of his office there. And as soon as Joe received this message from Governor Ford, knowing that Governor Ford's in Carthage just 25 miles away, he called together the Nauvoo City Council for the last time under his office as mayor, where they read all of the affidavits that we've discussed today and in last week's episode. And then they compiled them all together and wrote this brief line in reply to Governor Ford. Quote, "Sir, the affidavits and handbills herewith connected are submitted for your excellency's consideration. Respectfully, I have the honor to be your obedient servant." Signed, Joseph Smith. So with this folder of affidavits and handbills under arm, John Bernheisel and second prophet of the Salt Lake City Church, John Taylor, set off for Carthage, suspecting that they would not be harmed during their mission because they had assurance of protection from the governor himself. Now that Governor Thomas Ford was on scene, a new set of factors needed to be considered in the calculus of both the Mormons and the anti-Mormons. Now that Daddy was in town, both sides needed to figure out how to best explain their conduct to get him on their side and make him punish the other side. Whoever Governor Ford sided with, broader Illinois history would reflect his decisions for decades to come. I've tried putting myself in Governor Ford's head for this time, but it's impossible. And his history of Illinois provides very little insight because the book is such a cold recitation of events with very little personal commentary. But really, what would a person do in his situation? The Mormons had acted in such a way that the state of Missouri had exterminated them, and Governor Lilburn Boggs completely botched it. How was Governor Ford to keep his state of Illinois from devolving into that same frenzy? If he mishandled this situation as Lilburn Boggs had, his political career couldn't take the hit, and he may even be assassinated like Port had tried to do with Lilburn Boggs, right? This whole situation was an absolute minefield for Governor Ford to walk into, and too many competing interests made facts a scarce commodity, when facts were exactly what Ford needed to conduct his office properly. Beyond the act of tyranny from burning the Expositor printing press, the Mormons were far more lawless than just inciting a riot. There was all that stuff about robbing people, about manufacturing bogus, and the questionable validity of the Nauvoo Charter to begin with that weighed in the balance as well. Could the Expositor issue be disentangled and handled separately from these other criminal acts? Could Governor Ford effectively prosecute a prophet, priest, and king who was operating a government within a government? Could the anti-Mormons be de-escalated from this precipice? Could the Mormons be brought into conformity with the law without them crying persecution? More importantly, in the day-to-day decision-making, who could be trusted? Even if Governor Ford did everything perfectly, could he rely on any of the anti-Mormons conducting themselves impartially? If he called out the militia, were they actually going to follow his orders? Or were they going to do what they were planning on doing all along under the color of law because they perceived that Governor Ford was on their side? Was anything that anybody said true? And how does one make a good decision with such little verifiable information amidst chaos and misinformation? When I try to view the world through Governor Ford's eyes, I cannot envy his position. For that matter, though, I don't envy any of the people involved here. And don't get me wrong, there were plenty of advantages to capitalize during this growing conflict. Look, Thomas Coke Sharp's Warsaw Signal, that was selling more copies of the paper than it ever had before. Colonel Levi Williams was leading the charge against the Mormons in an effort to posture himself as a decisive and hard-on-crime person for the coming election. Nationwide, Joseph Smith was getting more press than he ever could buy because papers across the country were covering this brewing conflict. The Mormons always had multiple locations designated as their retreat position in the event of another extermination, which seemed imminent at this point, and that location would be far outside the boundaries of any legal authority, and they would be more able to truly build the theocracy that they attempted to build in Nauvoo. If Governor Ford handled this situation perfectly, he had a good future in politics. There's a lot of good opportunities that are arising from this conflict. But for each of those positive outlooks, there were plenty of drawbacks. If Governor Ford handled this conflict as terribly as Governor Lilburn Boggs had handled the Mormon problem in Missouri, Governor Ford's political career and possibly his life were over. If the whole conflict with the Mormons were just handled in the courts where this all belonged, that wasn't exactly the climax that the Warsaw Signal was riling people up to expect. If Joe was taken into the courts, he'd likely be arrested and the rest of his life would be clouded with criminal hearings and transfers among prisons in Illinois and Missouri until he met his demise at the gallows where he belonged. If Joseph was arrested, what would happen to the Mormon movement who considered him their one and only prophet? And on the flip side of that proposition, if Joe was too well protected by his militia to arrest, and he waged open warfare against state militias that his Nauvoo Legion far outmanned and outgunned, what would happen? What would that look like? The results of another Mormon war would not look like it did in Missouri because the Mormon leadership had learned so much from their previous war. Illinois was a big state, and there were a lot of non-Mormon settlements the Mormons could pillage for supplies to sustain a war effort for months. The Illinois militias didn't have that luxury. Plus, the Mormons had direct access to the largest commercial river in America at the time, and they could control the passage of ships on the Mississippi. In fact, the Warsaw Signal reported on June 19th, a day after Joe declared martial law, that the Iowa, a steamer, quote, reports that she was not allowed to land her passengers at Nauvoo, the city having been declared by the prophet under martial law, end quote. While not even engaged in actual war, the martial law powers of Joe's kingdom were able to thwart passage of a steamer on the Mississippi, the largest commercial river in America. The Mormon settlement was also very close in proximity to many Native American settlements, and Joe had been currying favor with chiefs of multiple tribes for years who were expecting a Mormon revolution as their opportunity to take revenge against the white man who had removed them from their lands in the first place. Honestly, it's just amazing. There's so many factors to take into consideration. And in possibly the most symbolic of any article published in the Warsaw Signal under Thomas Sharp, the report from Thomas Sharp saying, quote, "A rumor is afloat that the Mormons have melted the type of the expositor office and converted them into bullets," end quote. That summarizes the mentality of the day more than anything that I could ever write. We simply can't imagine an analog of this in America today. And look, stuff like this happens all over the globe every day. Tyrants rise and fall. But a modern day example of this happening in America is very hard to bring to reality. And I've made this analogy before, but it bears repeating. Suppose a chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood opened up in Oregon and started amassing converts, tens of thousands of converts in just a few short years. And after just 5 years of gaining tens of thousands of followers, or if we account for population inflation, it'd be about 153,000 people, because Mormons were about 4% of the Illinois population in 1844. 153,000 would be about 4% of Oregon's population right now. And after just 5 years of this Muslim Brotherhood chapter in Oregon movement gaining traction, they establish their own government. They harbor fugitives. They print their own money. Then they seize control of the Columbia River. And of course, the federal government is flummoxed, because every time that they try to send in officers to arrest the leaders of this chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood, those officers are arrested and imprisoned in their little city. And to make matters worse, the government allows such broad deference to Christian sects, so any laws that they pass to overcome the growing power of this Muslim regime would be discriminatory against one religion, right? Oh yeah, I forgot to mention this. For this thought exercise, all of these Muslims, they're all white Muslims, and they're all preppers with basements full of supplies and guns and ammunition that they can legally stockpile. That feels like it's a really important distinction to make for this thought exercise. But they also have politicians in their pockets, and their power is growing. And they're exchanging letters with the President of the United States. How would the governor of Oregon deal with this? How would the FBI deal with this? How would our president deal with this? And interestingly, this isn't even a thought exercise that's that far away from reality. Remember the whole Cliven Bundy armed standoff against the government back in 2014, and then his son taking over the bird sanctuary a couple years later in Oregon? Google the Bundys, Cliven Bundy, if you don't know what I'm talking about. But the Bundys are crazy prepper Mormons steeped in the writings of Cleon Skousen and Ezra Taft Benson, who spent days pointing loaded semi-automatic rifles at FBI agents for an entire week. Cliven Bundy's son, Ammon Bundy, called himself Captain Moroni when they took over the wildlife refuge in 2016. The anti-government, the anti-society, and the religious supremacy elements created by Joseph Smith in Nauvoo and perfected by Bloody Brigham Young in Utah are alive and well to this day, even if the armed standoffs and the acts of overt insurrection are at a much smaller scale proportionately than Joseph Smith's theocracy. The world of June 1844 makes a lot more sense if Governor Ford, Thomas Sharp, the anti-Mormon Levi Williams, and every other non-Mormon citizen of the state of Illinois could just see the truth, that they were living on Mormon land. Joe was just nice enough to let them borrow it for now. That's going to do it for our episode today. Have a little bit of house cleaning, a couple announcements to get through really quick. First announcement, we have another Q&A coming up. Now, Q&As for the show, I try and I kind of want them to be based on the material that we're discussing right now, but the Q&A is very broad. So whatever you might have questions about in Mormon history or in even Mormon current events, but particularly in Nauvoo 1844 history, I would be more than happy to answer any questions you may have. So how do you ask a question? You tag Naked Mormonism on Twitter or on Facebook or wherever you do social media stuff, or you send in an email to nakedmormonism@gmail.com with your question. And of course, patrons of the show over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. We're going to have a special Q&A thread there for your questions. And those questions obviously are going to be given first consideration because y'all are supporting the show financially. You deserve to have your questions answered. So if that's something that interests you, we're going to do a live broadcast on YouTube on Monday, May 11th. 2020. That's coming up this upcoming Monday that you're hearing this. Maybe you're listening to it after, and if that's the case, I'm sorry about that. But hey, if it's Monday night and you're in lockdown currently and you want to come hang out, please do. Or if not, you're going to have the audio from it posted up on the Patreon exclusive feed. And you're also going to have the video of that broadcast onto the Naked Mormonism YouTube channel. There were some tech difficulties last time. I think I have worked them out. It's always kind of a bit of a trouble working through tech difficulties, but we kind of do our best over here. So with that, we'll also have some new patrons that I want to thank. We've had some pledge deletions, which is extremely understandable given current events. Watch the news. But we've also had quite a few new pledges on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. So I really want to thank these people for stepping up to the plate. First, we have a pledge by Anders, by Adam, by The Trigger. You triggered, bro? The Trigger. A new pledge by Jacob, Joshua, by Zoe, which I just love that name. I don't know what it is, but the name Zoe just does something special for me. By Zoe, by Wilco de Jong, Wilco, Tango out. And also a new pledge by Kelly. So a whole bunch of new pledges. So to all of the people stepping up to the plate, whether you're, I don't know what your current circumstances are, you're able to do that. It really means a lot to me. So I want to thank you all so much for pledging to support the show, and to all of our patrons who give money to me to fund this research. I deeply thank you so much. Patrons of the show also get extra exclusive content, and I want to address really quick an email that came in from Jean. Hi, Jean. Jean and all of the Woka ladies. Hi, all of y'all. Y'all are awesome. Thanks for listening to the show. So Jean is apparently having some trouble with the patron exclusive feed. I've answered her email personally, but I want to answer it also on the show. The patron exclusive feed is a feed that you get access to when you pledge to support the show, and it gives you a special RSS feed. Now, an RSS feed is basically what a pod catching app uses to determine when a new episode comes out of a podcast. It's basically like your frequency, only in internet land. If you're broadcasting on radio of like AM 1298 or whatever, or AM 1250, I guess it would be. They're just up by 10s or by 50s or whatever. So the RSS feed is basically the frequency that your podcast uses in order to determine when you have a new episode. So when you support the show, you get an email that has that exclusive RSS feed in it. And what you have to do in order to listen to those exclusive episodes, which is extended editions of every new episode, as well as an extra episode every week, you have to use that RSS feed in whatever podcatching app you're using, and that will bring up the Naked Mormonism patron exclusive feed. And your podcatching app will ask you to enter in your patron login credentials in order to get access to that feed. It's a little complicated. I wish that there were a better and more user-friendly system developed for it, but this is currently what happens when you have a new medium that a lot of different companies are exploring and kind of experimenting with. Some things are just kind of counterintuitive and not very easy to use. So with that, I also have to say I did not get an extra episode to patrons this Monday. I usually alternate, regular episodes drop Thursday nights, and patron exclusive episodes drop on Monday nights. I didn't get one out this week. It came to you on Thursday with the regular episode. It's reading through the manuscript story, Conneaut Creek, the Solomon Spaulding manuscript that we have. That's kind of what happens when all of your time is absorbed reading through 30 affidavits and 10 different letters and then trying to find only the most important ones and boiling all of those down into 15 pages of script. I'm sorry, I just didn't get to it this week. But hopefully you see that next episode of Manuscript Story in your podcatching app if you're a patron subscriber. All right. Anyway, final announcement. My Book of Mormon is officially done now. Now, listeners, if you don't know about this, My Book of Mormon podcast, when Marie came on and took over the show for David Michael, Marie and I read through the Doctrine and Covenants, and we provided historical context in it after David Michael had already read through the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. He brought me on to provide historical context for the Doctrine and Covenants. Well, Marie and I read through all of the canonized revelations. We read through all of Joseph Smith's non-canonized revelations, and now we read through all of the Community of Christ revelations, which is a fascinating experiment to understand the history of the two churches juxtaposed side by side, reading through their versions of the Doctrine and Covenants. And now we have officially concluded My Book of Mormon podcast. So if you want to go over to My Book of Mormon and listen to our final episode, we kind of give a rundown of exactly what happened and how it all came to be and kind of our general thoughts after completing this many, many years long project. In fact, the first episode that Marie and I did together was 6/6 of 2016, 6616. I love it. It's a fantastic number. And now, 4 years later, almost, we're finally done with My Book of Mormon podcast. So anybody who is a patron supporter on My Book of Mormon, we're no longer taking income from that. Basically, any money that is given to the My Book of Mormon patron page, with extra episodes every week as well, that is all just going into a singular fund to keep the podcast on air, to pay the hosting fees for the podcast in perpetuity. So if you haven't checked in with My Book of Mormon for a long time, Marie and I really had a lot of fun going through all of the revelations that we possibly could and discussing the historical context, both in the Salt Lake City Church and in the Community of Christ. She taught me a lot of history about the RLDS Church under the sons of Joseph Smith and his grandsons. And it's just a fascinating way to understand the context of these two competing factions that, were born from the same religious roots, and to see how different they really are. So if that's something that interests you, or if, you haven't checked in with My Book of Mormon for a long time and, you want to hear the final episode that we do together, that's available for you. And My Book of Mormon is going to live on in cyberspace for as long as we have people who are supporting the monthly hosting fees for the podcast. That sounds like it. So I think that's everything that we had to cover for all the housekeeping, all the announcements, all the everything. And once again, we're going to do the hangout. That's this upcoming Monday night, May 11th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. pop in your questions, Naked Mormonism on Facebook and Twitter, or nakedmormonism@gmail.com, or in the Patreon exclusive thread. And with all that done and over with, this turned out to be a longer episode than I expected. I'm sorry about that. Thank you all so much for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.